Yeah, and you'll see people say that they'll criticize shows that criticize our show for only covering famous cases. Like you get that sometimes, which is weird for to call us say that about us. But nevertheless, the people will say that. Like, when we start the Adnan series, oh, there they go. They covered another famous case. I just tell you, famous cases are what get the downloads. Like, I don't care how much people say they wish podcasts would cover cases that nobody covers. Those cases do not get the downloads. People listen to everybody listens to the same things. They're going to listen to Maura Murray. They're going to listen to Adnan Syed. They're going to listen to West Memphis 3. They're going to listen to those. And when you cover cases that are not as well known, they're not going to. And it just so happens that most of these missing and murdered Indigenous women cases are not well known. There are a few that are more well covered, but frankly, if they're well covered, it's because of podcasts. It's not because of mainstream media. And we've talked about this before. Ashley Loring, Heavy Runner, who we did, Payne Lindsay covered her case. So her case is more well known than other people's. There are several cases that have become the source of their own podcast, and so they're more well known. But beyond that, these cases are just deserts of information. I always go back to the Jack family. The fact that you could have an entire family disappear and there's nothing out there. Nothing. Like, how was that even possible? But that's the way it is. And I think Alice is 100% right. The only way, it's just incumbent on all of us to do these stories and to do them well.
That's Brett Talley, an attorney and the co-host of the Prosecutors and Legal Briefs podcast.
I love that silver lining. See how I worked that in? No, I think that's exactly right. The flip side to that is our costs to publishing or cost, barriers to entry to cover these cases is incredibly low. And we can't control the consumer aspect in terms of who clicks on it, but we can control what we choose to cover. And, it's really funny because one of the things that we hear when we cover cases that are not covered because they don't get ratings on mainstream media is, they're covering cases they don't know anything about. The reason there's nothing out there is because we're not investigative journalists. But if there's no attention on cases, there's not going to be information because law enforcement and also just in general, these cases are sadly, there are so many cases. And the ones that have attention get more resources. And so, it's so funny because it really is a chicken and an egg problem. And when people criticize us for covering cases where there's not a lot of information, part of it is choosing to not be the problem and say, you're right, I don't have information about this case. And here's why. Because this other girl who disappeared 5 miles down the road is adorable with blonde hair, blue eyes. And she has, the entire force and all these Redditors trying to solve her case for her. While 5 miles down the road, we have this girl that no one even knows how to pronounce her name because no one has said it on air before. So we're going to choose to say her name and we're going to choose to see which avenues of investigation could be available because they've never even been investigated.
That's Alice LaCour, who's also an attorney and co-host of the Prosecutors and Legal Briefs podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jayson Blair. This is the second of 2 episodes with Brett Talley and Alice LaCour, both attorneys who are hosts of the Prosecutors and Legal Briefs podcast and who've become leading voices in the true crime community and who frequently use their analysis of cases to support those working within the criminal justice system. If you haven't heard the first episode, I recommend you go back and listen to that as well. In that episode, we focused on what inspired Brett and Alice to drive them toward the law and the podcast, the importance of consuming different perspectives, and using critical thinking when it comes to exploring issues like crime. We also discussed why they end up covering topics that they have very little interest in, and the impact of new forms of media on the criminal justice system. Alice and Brett started the highly rated Prosecutors podcast in May of 2020, only a few months after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since Brett, Alice, and I last sat down for a conversation in July of last year, They won the 2023 People's Choice Creator of the Year Award for the Prosecutors and have taken on several complex cases, including the murders of Heyman Lee and Robert Iwan and the questionable conviction of Leo Schofield Jr. Brett and Alice joined me for 2 great episodes in July of last year where we talked about their lives in the criminal justice system. I've been on their second podcast, Legal Briefs, to discuss the media circus surrounding the leaks in the case of the murders of 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby Germain in Delphi, Indiana. Brett and Alice also recently appeared on ABC's 2020 to discuss the Schofield case. They've recently begun a series on the case of Karen Reed, a Massachusetts woman who has been accused of second-degree murder and the hit-and-run death of her boyfriend, Officer John O'Keefe. Each of these cases have received tremendous amount of attention, but in some ways, across very different times in media, both new and old, the landscape has shifted. One thing that recently caught my attention was an article that Brett and Alice wrote for Fox News that summed up some of my thoughts as a former journalist on how our coverage of crime in a world of YouTube, TikTok, Substack, and other social media means has created a conflict between the good that citizen journalists can do and the damage that can be done. One needs to look no further than the case of the missing 22-year-old woman, Gabby Petito, who went missing in 2021 and was murdered in Wyoming. An internet sleuth noticed a detail in a social media post that helped law enforcement narrow in on where she was. 4 additional bodies of missing persons were found as a direct result of the search for Petito and also the search for the suspect in her case. One only needs to look to Idaho to find the opposite effect, where 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in December 2022. There, you can see where a TikTok personality accused a University of Idaho associate professor with killing the students in a viral video that led to harassment of the professor, who was never a suspect. The criminal justice system has struggled with how to handle these changes in the media. Judges now routinely impose gag orders that decrease transparency on court proceedings. Law enforcement often stands silent before and after an arrest, leading to a vacuum that fills with TikTok, YouTube, and Reddit rumors that ultimately may impact the public's faith in the justice system. But we don't just explore the downsides. We look at, as Alice puts it, the silver linings. In these episodes, we discuss many cases, including the Delphi murders, the Karen Reed case, the trial and conviction of Alec Murdaugh and the murders of his wife Maggie and his son Paul, and Lois Ann Rice, the Minnesota woman convicted of killing her husband and her doppelganger, but also other cases that get less attention, like Ashley Loring Heavyrunner, 20-year-old Native woman who wanted to help find missing Indigenous women, only to become one of them. Or the Jack family, whose 4 family members vanished without a trace in 1989 in British Columbia and is linked to other unsolved cases against Indigenous people in Canada along what is known as the Highway of Tears. Today, we're going to focus on the alarming trend of judges issuing gag orders to address their challenges with new forms of media and how those gag orders also silence families. We're going to discuss the work Alice and Brett have done with law enforcement based on the lessons learned from the cases that they've analyzed for their podcast and the upsides of new forms of media that allow for more coverage of cases of those who are often invisible, like those missing and murdered Indigenous people. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and you get a chance, if you haven't already, to listen to last week. One thing I was reading recently, I was reading some, I forget where the research was, but I was reading some research recently that said that judges are increasingly issuing gag orders in cases. In more and more cases, they're preventing, the attorneys from speaking, but also witnesses, which often includes family members and others. And, one of the they were speculating on some of the reasons why judges were issuing gag orders, and some of it came down to this idea or this notion that in this world of immediate content creation and new forms of media plus traditional media, judges are just throwing their hands up because they don't know what to do to ensure a fair trial, and that the safest thing for them at times they feel is to throw up a gag order. And one of the things I was thinking too, like there are some real downsides to gag orders when we're talking about that idea we were talking about before of a vacuum. And I was wondering what thoughts you guys had on that. Because you've been on both sides of you've worked as prosecutors, you've worked as creators.
I think gag orders, we've talked about it a little bit on our show. There was a time where they made sense when you had sort of a very narrow funnel of information, and you could kind of block that funnel to ensure that your jury wasn't tainted and somebody got a fair trial. That is not now. I think now we have to rely on the old, the solution. The cure for bad speech is more speech. And right. I think having a gag order, it just means that the people who maybe are closest to the case and might actually know something about the case and might actually have some moral standing to speak are not able to. And the people who fill those voids are not necessarily the people you want with the megaphone. And I think Delphi is a great example of that. I think the fact that the family is muzzled while you have all kinds of people speaking for them, but also spreading misinformation, and they can't do a thing about it. I think that is a huge mistake. And I wish judges were going the other way. I wish gag orders were becoming less and less prevalent, because I don't think they actually do their job of protecting the jury pool and ensuring a fair trial for the defendant. All they do is lead to some of the problems we've been talking about.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the problem with gag orders is it's kind of something that was used to solve a problem that had a single funnel for information back in the day. But today, judges are using it to try and control kind of a medium that they have no control over. Not that they shouldn't, or it shouldn't be controlled in some way, but it is the wrong tool for what they're trying to achieve. And as a result, there are massive negative externalities from using the wrong tool for the wrong job. And so, we obviously think more information generally is better. As prosecutors, it takes a lot for us to, for example, seal a courtroom or to file a document under seal, because the presumption is always that the judiciary is open to the public, right? The only power the judiciary has is the buy-in from the public. If people decided to stop abiding by court orders, the whole country isn't going to get jailed, right? I mean, that's the scary secret, and that's why.
You and what army is who was it
exactly.
to the Supreme Court? I can't remember. Was that Johnson or I can't?
And so we do really, very well believe that the public should know as much as possible. And the problem with these gag orders, that was not the unintentional consequence, was misinformation is filling the vacuum, because people have such an intense curiosity for what it is, and those with perhaps less information are putting information out there, which is exactly not what you want. You don't have people with less information, filling the void, or people who may not have the best intentions and know that their voice will go uncountered in that space, because those who are abiding by the gag order will not say anything back because they cannot and should not. So, I think this is something new to this age, and we're going to have to take a fresh look at it. And it's not to warp an old tool for a new problem.
Yep. And it kind of brings together all of the sort of problems you guys have been talking about without gatekeepers or that single funnel, and it being so easy for people to publish. And if people also don't care about the truth, but I feel like I might be being a little unfair there, because some people are just not good at getting at the truth. It may not be that they don't care about it. They're just not good at it. Did you see that very nice way I put it? But So, you combine all those things and you mentioned the Delphi case, and I think there are other cases where you can take an example. Like, if I look at a case like that and I think to myself, like, what is the biggest thing that's come out of that? And I were to step back and just kind of think about what people say about it. It's loss of trust in the system. Like, people don't necessarily trust the courts are going to do the right thing. They don't necessarily trust that some of the attorneys are going to do lots of things. And I think it sort of feels like some of that vacuum contributed to it early on, and it may still right now. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's a huge problem. And that's something we talk about with police officers is this immense responsibility that police officers have to always be professional, to always do their jobs and to do their jobs properly, no matter how difficult that can be. No matter how tough your day's been, everybody's yelling at you and calling you names and doing all this stuff, and you feel like everybody hates you and you're not making that much money. That when you decide to be a police officer, you take on this huge mantle because the entire profession is going to be judged by you. And when people lose faith in the profession, it makes all of this more difficult. It makes solving cases more difficult. It makes having people trust you to come to you and say, I know what happened. There are just a lot of communities where the faith in the police is so low, they're not going to do that. And I think you're seeing that across institutions across the country. And it makes it so easy for people to believe things that ordinarily would be unbelievable. It is unbelievable that the courts and prosecutors, take Delphi. I hate to keep going back to Delphi, but there are people who think there is a conspiracy that reaches throughout the state, levels of government, to frame one person and to protect another group of people. And that should be unbelievable to you ordinarily. But because people have lost faith, they're like, well, is that unbelievable or is that possible? And then you'll see people point to different things. They'll say, well, in this case, this person did this thing. So why shouldn't we believe that it happened here? And that's a huge problem. And it's why I am not, like you were saying, I try not to be overly critical of people because they are coming to these places for a reason. And if you ignore the reason and you just say, well, they're a bunch of idiots, they're a bunch of morons, only a moron could think it. No, actually, a whole lot of really smart people think it. Why do they think it? And figuring that out and addressing that's the really hard part.
Where the sort of that void, or maybe both for the media and for prosecutors. I'm going to ask you guys about the Karen Read case. I know you're in the middle of covering it. And I know I don't think you guys on the episodes I've heard so far have really talked about the media coverage of it. But it's the media coverage in that case is another example of, both in the traditional media and the new forms of media, it's gotten an enormous amount of coverage, but it certainly seemed like in that case, a lot of opinions were shaped in the public. Were shaped by some really good coverage, some really questionable coverage, but it's really sort of, I don't know whether, I guess my question for you guys is, it certainly affected the public thoughts about it, the public's faith in law enforcement, because as a part of the conspiracy theory, there are several law enforcement and I suppose paramedics and I suppose everyone involved in it. But do you think that kind of lack of faith that can be created by that kind of coverage is burrowing down to the jury these days? That it can really actually impact an outcome in a case? Or is that to be seen?
So, part of the voir dire process, right? And voir dire is just the questioning of the jury before you pick a jury, is to try and find people who haven't listened to that coverage or have listened to it and keep an open mind. And a lot of people, especially if you're following cases that seem to be ever present in the media, like Karen Read, like Delphi, you may think, oh, it's impossible to seat a jury who is completely untarnished by media. The good thing is we all tend to be very self-focused in our view of the world, where we think everything must be what I see, is not actually the case for many people. So I am hopeful and want to continue to believe in our judicial system and the jury system, that the jury process and also the oath you take at the beginning of being impaneled as a jury member really does impact you. It is not so simple as just raising your hand, rolling your eyes, and sitting down. Depending on the judge, and I worked for a judge who deeply cared about the civic service and the democratic element of the jury system and spent almost an entire morning or afternoon, depending on how long it took to seat a jury, to explain that very core constitutional right that these defendants had and the role that each juror had in that system. So that there's a lot of talk that people can have outside of the courtroom. But when you are weighed down with the weight of the Constitution that was written, generations ago, and it is a system that when left with your own thoughts and not sitting in the midst of TikTok videos and 24-hour media presence, because once you're on a jury, you can't listen to that media, and you're left with your own thoughts and the import of what you've been charged with by your country. It's a very different kind of opportunity that people.
It feels heavy.
It feels incredibly heavy.
And people take it seriously.
People really do. We will hear people talk big talk in the voir dire room and be like, well, anyone who's charged is automatically guilty, et cetera, et cetera. And then they get called back and questioned one-on-one, and to see these people's kind of egos and personas melt away when the import of what is before them, that someone else's life and potentially lots of people's lives, right? The defense's theory in the Karen Read case is a conspiracy that, if true, would ruin potentially dozens of people, if not an entire town, right? If true, it has real impact on real people's lives.
Well,
it already has had real impact.
And probably every case, if you think about it, because I think, just one defendant being imprisoned, it's not just them, it's their family members, it's their loved ones, it's the separation from their kids. Like, I think when you start to think of, maybe even if you don't know necessarily all of that about the person, you think about the price that people pay. And it's not just the defendant who's convicted. It's a pretty heavy weight.
It's never just the defendant. In fact, usually it's everybody else who suffers a lot more than the defendant. And you see that, and you go to a sentencing and the whole family's in the gallery, and their kids and their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. And it's one of those things where that can't be the decider. You can't let someone who's committed a pretty serious crime, it's like, well, we don't want to hurt everybody else, so we're not going to put you in prison. But I think it is a hidden cost that most people never recognize. And the generational cost. I mean, we see, the thing that always blows my mind is you'll talk to guys who 15 years ago brought down a drug trafficking organization, and they'll tell you the kids of those guys are now running the new drug trafficking organization. And it's just like, man, that sort of generational, just entire generations ruined by crime. But I think, bringing it back to what Alice was saying, I think juries typically do take things very seriously. The subconscious stuff's hard to say, right? Like, what baggage do you walk into now that you're inundated with this stuff that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise? I feel like one of the advantages we're having on the Read case is I didn't follow it at all until it started. Like, I barely knew anything about it. Didn't even know how John O'Keefe died. I had vague notions of who this Turtle Boy guy was, right? So I'm able to listen to the witnesses without all of that. And I think if the jury is able to do that, that's great. If they are coming in with this baggage, even if they think they've set it aside, then how much of the case is being decided at trial and how much of it was decided before they walked through the door?
Right.
And it's not necessarily to the benefit of either side. Now, you might think, well, Turtle Boy's been out there so much that if they've heard something about it, they're probably thinking Karen Read's innocent. Or maybe they think Turtle Boy is a crazy person.
Is insane.
Anybody who would be aligned with him is obviously guilty. I mean, you never know. And this notion, and we're seeing this more and more, and you see people discussing this case, where they act as though part of having a fair trial is having an active effort to influence the jury and the trial in the media. It's like, no, that is not how this should work. It is not a good thing if the media coverage is influencing the jury. That is a very bad thing. And
That's
how
rule by
you
mob,
balance that?
right? It may work for this situation, but it may not work the next time. That's why we've chosen a judicial system with due process rather than rule by mob.
Right. Well, it's an interesting point because you're making me think of something I never thought about, because I've heard from many a defense attorney complaining that, the prosecutors get to tell their story in the indictment or the press conference, and then, gag order comes into place and we don't get to tell our story. And I think for the first time, I think that there is an important reason to have information out there, but I think for the first time I'm wondering, like, okay, why is it so important for you to be able to tell that story? Well, the only real reason is to influence the jury, and maybe more time should be, I guess, more focus should be on the courtroom or in the courtroom, at least for the attorneys that are involved. I was going to ask you guys the flip side. So sort of like going away, because I was thinking at CrimeCon, I had the chance to meet, through the help of your editor, Jayson Ursay, one of the Petito family members, Gabby Petito's family members, also met two Native women who had lost loved ones, who in both of the cases went missing and were murdered. And I think Brett and I were having a conversation recently. I can't remember where it was. Yes, I think we were having a conversation recently where we were talking about the idea that when we do stories on Indigenous people, we can see our downloads drop. And all that does is make me want to do more. So, but with that, like, I think we, like, as podcasters or people in this broader content space, whether you're a YouTube creator, we have an opportunity to bring cases, right? And I bring up the downloads drop that, if anyone's ever worked in television, you realize that ratings drive everything. Now in newspapers online, it's all about clicks, right? And sadly, I have a hard time believing that doesn't influence decisions, but we as podcasters or YouTube creators who are out there or whatever you are, we have an opportunity to bring light to cases that other people don't. And I think that that's sort of like the flip side of it. Like when you think of, sort of invisible minorities or Indigenous people or other people, the disabled or other people that the media tends to sort of drive right by, we're sort of blessed with this cool opportunity to, even if it's like banging our heads against the wall for a while, to really bring attention to things. Immigrant families are another example. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that silver lining. See how I worked
Thank
that
you.
in? No, I think that's exactly right. The flip side to that is our costs to publishing or barriers to entry to cover these cases is incredibly low. And we can't control the consumer aspect in terms of who clicks on it, but we can control what we choose to cover. And it's really funny because one of the things that we hear when we cover cases that are not covered because they don't get ratings on mainstream media is, they're covering cases they don't know anything about. The reason there's nothing out there is because we're not investigative journalists, but if there's no attention on cases, there's not going to be information because law enforcement and also just in general, these cases are sadly, there are so many cases, and the ones that have attention get more resources.
Yep.
And so, it's so funny because it really is a chicken and an egg problem. And when people criticize us for covering cases where there's not a lot of information, part of it is choosing to not be the problem and say, you're right, I don't have information about this case. And here's why. Because this other girl who disappeared 5 miles down the road is adorable with blonde hair, blue eyes. And she has, the entire force and all these Redditors trying to solve her case for her. While 5 miles down the road, we have this girl that no one even knows how to pronounce her name because no one has said it on air before. So we're going to choose to say her name, and we're going to choose to see which avenues of investigation could be available because they've never even been investigated.
I feel like your critics might be missing the point there.
Well, and that's okay, because that is a problem, because I bet you mainstream media is saying the same thing. There's not a lot of clicks. We don't know a lot of information. We can't cover it. So what if us smaller content creators, like podcasters who have lower barriers to entry, bring more, we don't have as many ears as maybe major networks, but we start the buzz, and then more people want to learn more about it. And eventually maybe that individual will get a Netflix documentary.
It's got to start somewhere, right?
Right.
It's got to, if not, where? Yeah. Brett.
Yeah. And you'll see people say that they'll criticize shows that criticize our show for only covering famous cases. Like, you get that sometimes, which is weird to say that about us. But nevertheless, the people will say that, like, when we start the Adnan series, oh, there they go. They covered another famous case. I just tell you, famous cases are what get the downloads. Like, I don't care how much people say they wish podcasts would cover cases that nobody covers. Those cases do not get the downloads. People everybody listens to the same things. They're going to listen to Maura Murray. They're going to listen to Adnan Syed. They're going to listen to West Memphis 3. They're going to listen to those. And when you cover cases that are not as well known, they're not going to. And it just so happens that most of these missing and murdered Indigenous women cases are not well known. There are a few that are more well covered, but frankly, if they're well covered, it's because of podcasts. It's not because of mainstream media. And we've talked about this before. Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, who we did, Payne Lindsay covered her case. So her case is more well known than other people's. There are several cases that have become the source of their own podcast, and so they're more well known. But beyond that, these cases are just deserts of information. I always go back to the Jack family. The fact that you could have an entire family disappear.
They were the ones in Canada, Native family in Canada that disappeared. Yeah.
And there's nothing out there. Nothing. Yeah. Like, how was that even possible? But that's the way it is. And I think Alice is 100% right. The only way, it's just incumbent on all of us to do these stories and to do them well, because they do need to be entertaining. This is entertainment.
And I think you guys are actually hitting on a really good point you have me thinking about here. It's that it's really easy for us to criticize the media and say the media doesn't cover those cases. But when you start to ask yourself the question of, well, why doesn't the media cover the cases? Well, we as the general public are not putting our eyeballs, our ears, our attention to these cases. So in some ways, the media is simply responding to as the general public's lack of interest or lack of caring. And I think it comes down to people who, and I don't think it's just people who don't look like us, because sometimes it's people who don't have similar experiences to us. And, it just makes me think, like, even for myself, like, making that effort to pay attention to things that are different than me is so valuable. And it's also my vote, right? It's my vote with the
most valuable thing you have.
No.
And I think taking it all the way back to the beginning of the conversation to kind of make it full circle is, I think we've lost creativity in a lot of media, because these stories, if you just take a moment and look at them, they should be grabbing us. They should be interesting to us. But I think we are so used to the shock factor or whatnot that we want the same trope. And so, the thing that you should get from me and Brett's backstories is we are so similar, despite what we may look like physically or on paper. Our stories are shockingly similar for being very different people. And I think that's the key to, as Brett was saying, making these stories relatable and entertaining, right? They may, on the surface, you may think, what do I have in common with, murdered Indigenous women in Canada living here in the United States, living a cushy life, having never encountered that sort of a lifestyle. Well, you know what? A good storyteller can show you how we have so much more in common than we don't. And so that's like a call to action for all the content creators is there is a story there. Are you good enough of a storyteller to make it relatable and then make people take notice? Because there absolutely is a thread of humanity across all of us. That's why true crime is entertaining, is because it's actually all of our own stories that we're seeing in other people's lives, even if they look different from us.
So I had an interview last week that's going to come out in a couple weeks, and I was off camera. It was a native mom who lost her son. And the comment she made afterwards, off camera, I guess, off recording, off mic, and the comment that she made afterwards is, I hope you can show them that our blood is the same color, that we bleed the same color. And I just stopped dead in my tracks and thought, like, I have a tendency to like go big picture, take critical thinking, like research a topic and go big. But I realized that on these cases, I just need to tell people stories just so we can get to the point where, it's funny listening to you guys being similar backgrounds, right? Like, but it's not just that you went to law school or you did other things like that. You struggled. You came from families that struggled. Both my parents came from families that struggled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is some connection. There's some commonality between all of us. And if you tell people stories in a good way, I guess you can show people that we all bleed the same color. So I was going to just reference the article you guys wrote. I think it was published. Was it published on the Fox News website? Is that the right place? In that, at the end of the article, you made the comment that truth matters and we need to make truth more valuable than fiction. And you also said that the most powerful resource listeners have is their time, which we sort of talked about. And I see the sort of connection between those things. But when we're thinking about truth and we're thinking about a better media landscape and we're thinking about being able to tell those stories and build those commonalities and, build people's capacity for empathy, what can listeners or viewers who care about these things, and if they're listening to my podcast, they probably care. What can they do?
Well, I think number one, you can hold people accountable. And the great thing about podcasts and YouTube and everything else is the distance from creator to listener is not that big at all. In fact, a lot of us are very engaged with our communities. We talk to our communities, we listen to them, we care about them. And I think that's generally true. And I think, sure, I mean, you have some people who are just bad actors out there who whatever are willing to do anything for a buck. But I don't think most people are like that. I think most people are, they're trying to build an audience. They want to be entertaining. They want people to listen to them. And if they hear from the people who they care about, who are their listeners, like, hey, I feel like you're kind of going off the rails here, or maybe you need to take a step back here, or, when you said that thing, that was a little too far. I actually think that can be a lot more effective than people think it can be. Now, your ability to influence ABC News is probably not that great. Your ability to influence a podcaster that you listen to, much greater, much greater.
Yeah, along those same lines, I would say, we've said this a lot tonight and also on our podcast. Don't suspend like your perception of reality and your analytical thinking. You're allowed to ask questions, especially to kind of those close content creators, whether it's a YouTube person or a podcaster. But ask questions and also ask where people base their conclusions on. What evidence do you have for the conspiracy? What evidence do you have for X, Y, and Z? And don't hold yourself as experts in areas where you may not be an expert. None of us are experts in every area, but you can always seek to learn more. And the law especially is something that is supposed to be accessible to everyone. It is knowable. You can absolutely essentially get a law degree online because all of the rules of evidence, everything that the courtroom is based on is available to you. And so don't kind of claim or hide behind, they know better than me, so I'm just going to agree with them. If something smells funny, ask questions. That's the only way we're going to get closer to the truth, is if we seek to ask honest questions of those who are holding themselves out with authority.
Well, thank you guys. So let me say that. I think at the very least, you've given us some good ideas for what I think listeners can do to help draw attention to important cases, and given us a good idea of some of the some of the difficulties that exist, at least in with media coverage and its impact on the court system. I was curious, just in closing, whether you guys had any closing thoughts about what you think can be done in the future to help sort of media coexist, the criminal justice system coexist, but also for us to get closer to a better truth for people, that meets these needs that people have for more immediacy, that, allows law enforcement and others to sort of do what they can to sort of step on some of the rumors that might affect the case. Like, what can we do to collectively, or what can the system do to sort of help us get closer to that truth and that beauty?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the system can do other than what we talked about earlier. I think people who are in positions of power and authority in law enforcement have to be held to the highest standards and have to hold themselves to the highest standards. I would say that consumers really are the most powerful people in all this. I mean, they have all the power. And I think curiosity gets us into this place. People are naturally curious, and it leads them down some strange rabbit holes sometimes. I would say actually embrace that curiosity, but make it a deep curiosity. Don't just take people when someone throws out a crazy idea, don't just take them at face value. Dig into that. Like, look for the evidence. If someone is telling you something that's extraordinary, ask for extraordinary proof. And if they can't give it to you, then question whether or not that premise that they've laid out for you is one that you want to believe in. I think we all want to know the truth. We absolutely do. And I think that's one of the reasons conspiracy theories are attractive, is because it points to a deeper truth, a secret truth that only a few people have. I want to get to that. But the reality is that usually whenever you have something like that, if you dig even further, you see that there's not a whole lot of foundation to it. It's built on sand and the whole thing will collapse. So embrace your curiosity, but do it in a deep, deep manner.
Yeah, right. Deep curiosity.
That was so well said. That was so well said. I don't know, have much to add. But I do think that deep curiosity is good, right? Don't be here for the entertainment, because I think a lot of people feel like they need to apologize for enjoying true crime. But what I said earlier, I think there is absolutely no shame in spending your time in true crime, because I think it is the ultimate existential crisis. It is seeking to understand the core of humanity, seeking to understand ourselves, right? The core question we hear all the time is, first, how can someone do something like this? We heard that all the time in the Alec Murdaugh case. How can a seemingly loving father who, by outside accounts, had success, do something so horrendous? Or how can it be that there can be such random acts of violence and random acts of just nonsensicalness, where a young girl like JonBenet Ramsey can end up dead in her own house, having truly done nothing, to deserve something like that? We seek to understand these things, and I think we should, because at core, we are all humans, and we want to live in a world where it is not possible for a father to kill their own child, where it is not possible for a young, innocent anyone to lose their life senselessly. These are all things, we talked about earlier. The state of the world as it is right now is not as it should be. And I think part of the drive to wanting to understand true crime can be very noble. But as all things, all good and noble things, they can be contorted. And so, first of all, I don't think you need to apologize if you enjoy true crime. But I think if you truly embrace what true crime is and why you are drawn to it, there can actually be immense good that comes from it. So stop apologizing for it. Instead, replace that, apology with deep curiosity, and we may all be in a better place.
Yeah, because it's really about society and culture and our understanding of the world as much as it is. It's just one component of all those things. And I think a lot of people do gravitate to true crime because it helps them understand the world around them. It helps them understand. I think our friend Julia Cowley, how does she put it? She's a former FBI profiler. She said it's about understanding the unimaginable sometimes that helps you better understand the world. Do you guys have, since we're on Patreon, do you have a minute to take a couple listener questions that I have collected?
Only for you.
Sure.
Aw, thank you very much. So, first one is from Peace, and it's, where do you guys see yourself in 10 years?
Not
10
doing
years
this.
older.
Probably
10 years older.
at my funeral. Do you think we're gonna have to wait 10 years? Let's be honest.
I am not one. I will say this. I think the most successful people in life can see themselves in 10 years. I've never been able to see myself even 5 years.
Myself in 10 minutes.
Yeah, no idea. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, where would I be? Would I say talking to Jason Blair about my podcast? Probably not. I probably would not have said that in 2014. So I'm going to say
well,
I
I'm
have
pretty
no
sure
idea.
in 2014 I would have been saying I'm never going to be talking to anybody again. Oh, good times.
I will say I can never have planned the life that I have, and I'm so glad that instead of planning it, I have walked through doors that seemed impossible to be open, and I just out of faith walked through them. And I hope I do that for the rest of my life because it has led me on some of the greatest adventures of my life, including this podcast.
Yeah. I agree. It's like it goes back to that idea about curiosity. If you just curiously float your way through the world, you'll find all sorts of interesting things you never would have expected. So another question is Brett. It's for Brett. When are you going to write your DB Cooper book?
When days add another 10 hours or so to them, I'll start writing my DB Cooper book.
It could really be good.
In the meantime, he's going to be available for hire for your themed parties as DB Cooper.
Exactly.
But you got to write the D Outlaw Pass book first.
Yeah, there you go. I have lots of books in the works.
That's right. So here's one from Julie Lynn, which is, what's a misconception about yourselves or prosecutors in general that you wish people would know?
All of them.
Well, yeah. I mean, prosecutors in general, we talk about this
First, blow up Reddit.
Right. Like this notion that winning is all that matters. I think a lot of people think that, and it's just not true. It's like fundamentally wrong. Prosecutors are very bad PR people. Defense attorneys are much better at PR.
Which I personally actually think is better for the judicial system. Right.
It probably
I actually
is.
want a
Yeah.
smooth talking prosecutor. I want a hardworking, evidence-based prosecutor, which then works against us in the media. But ultimately, I think that is a better prosecutor.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Whoa, let's see. We got the 10 years question. We got that one. And here's the last one. It's
Valerie is
Valerie.
such a gem.
Yeah. How dare you guys? It's so hard to compete.
We're just good at faking it.
Oh, anyway. All right. So how many? 43 of our best friends are left. So guys, wish you well. I'll record my outro later. Everybody have a great night. We really enjoyed seeing you. It looks like it's a lot of prosecutor people, lots of my people. So very cool.
Awesome.
All right. Anything you guys want to tell them? When are you guys coming back for Karen Reed episode 30 through 96?
I don't know. Probably sometime this week. I don't know. We still got to schedule our recordings.
Like we said, we live on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
10
Yeah.
years. I'm going to need 10 minutes
10
ahead.
years. All right, guys. We'll see you later. Have a great night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for having us, Jayson.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you
Jayson.
for coming. I enjoyed it. I want to take a moment to thank some of our Patreons for their contributions, which help us continue to do the work that we hope brings good in the world and delivers those silver linings. For this episode, I'd like to thank some of them: Thomas B., Heather R., Jada, Kirsten K., Kathy B., Clinton B., Paula K., Rosie, Daphne S., Julia C., and Heather M. Not only does your support help us make a difference by helping us tell these stories, you're an inspiration and have also come up with some of the best episode ideas. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And for everyone else, if you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.